There are some places that never let you go. Even if you leave, even if you grow up, they stay with you. In your dreams, in your fears, and sometimes in the very shadows of your life. For my sister, Evelyn, and me, that place was Blackthorn Orphanage. It's been 20 years since we left, but it feels like yesterday. The memories don't fade, no matter how much I try. And now that Evelyn has disappeared, I'm forced to return to the one place I swore I'd never go back to. I hadn't seen Evelyn in 3 years. We'd drifted apart after she moved to a small, nameless town in the mountains. She always loved the quiet, and I thought maybe she'd finally found the peace we'd both been searching for. But when I got her letter, everything changed. It wasn't long, just a few sentences scrawled in her hurried handwriting. "Sophia, I need you. They've found me. Come to Blackthorn. Don't tell anyone." The letter was dated 2 weeks ago. Blackthorn. Just seeing the name made my stomach turn. It was the orphanage where we'd spent most of our childhood after our parents died in a car accident. The place where whispers filled the halls, where shadows danced in the corners of your vision, and where children disappeared in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. I thought it had been abandoned for years. Apparently, I was wrong. The drive to Blackthorn took 6 hours, winding through thick forests and narrow mountain roads. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows over the landscape. The orphanage loomed at the end of a gravel path, its windows dark and lifeless. The paint was peeling, the roof sagging, and vines crawled up the walls like skeletal fingers. It looked like something out of a nightmare, and yet it felt unchanged. I parked my car and hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Every instinct told me to leave, but Evelyn's face flashed in my mind. I couldn't abandon her. Not again. The front door creaked as I pushed it open. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of mold and decay. Dust coated every surface, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. "Evelyn!" I called, my voice echoing through the empty halls. There was no answer. Walking through Blackthorn felt like stepping back in time. The long corridors, the faded wallpaper, the cracked mirrors, it was all the same. I could almost hear the laughter of the other children, the clatter of footsteps as we raced to avoid the stern gaze of Miss Carmichael, the headmistress. Evelyn and I had been inseparable back then. She was the bold one, always standing up for me when the older kids picked on us. She'd drag me into trouble, sneaking into the attic or exploring the woods behind the orphanage. But there were rules we never broke, rules whispered among the children late at night. Never go into the basement, never open the door at the end of the west wing, and never, ever follow the shadows. I wandered through the halls, calling Evelyn's name. My footsteps echoed, the only sound in the oppressive silence. When I reached the west wing, I stopped. The door at the end of the hall was ajar, its frame warped and splintered. As a child, I'd never dared go near it. But now, something compelled me forward. The air grew colder as I approached, and I could hear a faint sound, like whispers, just beyond the threshold. "Evelyn?" I called again, my voice shaking. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a single piece of paper lying on the floor. It was a photograph, yellowed with age. 2 girls stared back at me, their faces pale and solemn. One was me, no older than 7, the other was Evelyn. But there was something wrong. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible, was a shadowy figure. Its shape was humanoid, but its face was featureless, just a blank, dark void. I dropped the photo, my heart racing. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. The whispers grew louder, circling me like a swarm of angry bees. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The shadows in the room shifted, coalescing into a shape, tall and thin, its arms impossibly long. It stood there, watching me, though it had no eyes. Then it spoke. "She belongs to us now." The voice was low and guttural, like the growl of an animal. "No," I said, backing away. "She's my sister. Where is she?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out, its hand stretching toward me. I felt a chill wash over me, so cold it burned. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The door creaked open and the whispers faded. I stumbled out of the room, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know what I'd just seen, but I knew one thing. Evelyn was in danger. I made my way back to the main hall, my mind racing. That's when I noticed something glinting on the floor. It was a key, old and rusted, with a small tag attached. The tag read, "Basement." Every instinct told me not to go down there. The basement was one of the forbidden places, the source of countless rumors among the children. But Evelyn's face flashed in my mind again, and I knew I had no choice. The basement door was hidden behind a heavy curtain near the dining hall. I hadn't even known it existed as a child. The key fit perfectly, and the door swung open with a groan. A narrow staircase spiraled downward, disappearing into darkness. The air that wafted up was damp and acrid, carrying the faint scent of decay. I descended slowly, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The walls were lined with crumbling bricks, and the floor was slick with moisture. At the bottom, the space opened up into a large, cavernous room. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, their shapes twisting and looping in ways that hurt my eyes if I stared too long. In the center of the room was a circle of stones, and in the middle of the circle was a figure. "Evelyn!" I shouted, running toward her. She was sitting on the ground, her knees pulled to her chest, her face hidden in her hands. "Evelyn, it's me," I said, kneeling beside her. She looked up slowly, and my heart sank. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and clammy. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Sophia," she whispered, "you shouldn't have come." Before I could respond, the room filled with the sound of whispers. They echoed off the walls, growing louder and louder until they were deafening. The shadows around us began to move, closing in like a living tide. "Evelyn, we have to go," I said, grabbing her arm. She shook her head. "It's too late. They won't let us leave." Who? Who won't let us leave?" The shadows coalesced into a single shape, towering over us. "Them," Evelyn said, her voice barely audible, and then the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. I couldn't see Evelyn anymore, but I could feel her trembling beside me. The whispers continued, their voices overlapping in a chaotic cacophony. "Stay close to me," I said, my voice shaking. I gripped her hand tightly, afraid she'd slip away again, but the moment I touched her, she yanked her hand back. "No," she said, her voice distant, almost mechanical. "They'll see you if you touch me." The whispering room. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls of the basement. Shapes moved in the darkness, their presence heavy and oppressive. My flashlight flickered, struggling against the gloom, but I caught glimpses. Long, thin limbs, hollow faces, and eyes like endless voids. "Evelyn, we have to move," I urged, fighting the rising panic in my chest. She didn't respond, she just stared at the shadows, her face pale and empty. "They've been here forever," she whispered. "Long before Blackthorn, they want something from us." "What do they want?" Her head tilted slightly as if listening. They want us to stay." A sharp sound broke through the whispers, a metallic scraping like nails on a chalkboard. The shadows recoiled, shifting back toward the edges of the room. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the source of the sound. A door was set into the far wall, heavy and rusted, with strange carvings etched into its surface. Without thinking, I grabbed Evelyn's arm and pulled her toward it. The door was chained shut, thick iron links crisscrossing its surface. The carvings on the metal glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "What is this?" I asked, more to myself than to Evelyn. Her eyes darted toward the shadows, then back to the door. "It's the only way out," she said, her voice barely audible. I didn't ask how she knew that. I didn't want to know. My hands shook as I grabbed the chains, pulling at them desperately. The metal was freezing cold, biting into my skin. Evelyn knelt beside me, helping untangle the links. The whispers grew louder, angrier. The shadows surged forward, their movements jerky and unnatural. "Hurry!" Evelyn cried. Finally, the last chain fell away. I pushed the door open with all my strength, and a blinding light poured through the crack. The shadows hissed, recoiling as the light washed over them. Evelyn and I stumbled through, slamming the door behind us. The light faded, leaving us in a narrow corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces warped and tarnished. "This wasn't here before," I muttered. "It's always been here," Evelyn said, her voice flat. I didn't understand what she meant, but I didn't press her. Her skin was even paler now, her movements sluggish, as if the very act of standing was draining her. We walked in silence, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the stillness. The mirrors seemed to shift as we passed, their surfaces rippling like water. In one of them, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. It was us, Evelyn and me, but we weren't alone. A shadowy figure stood behind us, its hand resting on Evelyn's shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. After what felt like hours, the corridor ended abruptly in another room. This one was smaller, with walls covered in faded drawings. I stepped closer, my stomach twisting, as I recognized the drawings. They were crude, but unmistakable, scenes from our childhood. The swings in the orphanage courtyard, the creaky stairs leading to the attic, Evelyn and me hiding under a blanket during a thunderstorm. "This is us," I whispered. "They've been watching," Evelyn said. Her voice startled me. I turned to see her standing by a small wooden desk in the corner of the room. On the desk was a notebook, its cover stained and worn. Evelyn picked it up, flipping through the pages. Her hands trembled as she read, her eyes darting back and forth. "What is it?" I asked. She didn't answer. She just handed me the notebook. The pages were filled with names, dates, and short, scribbled notes. My chest tightened as I saw names I recognized, children who had vanished from Blackthorn years ago. Samuel Jenkins, age 6, taken by the shadow in the West Wing. Emily Carter, age 8, lured into the woods by the whispers. Evelyn Harper, age 10, marked by the Hollow Man. My breath caught in my throat. "Evelyn," I said, my voice shaking. This is you." Evelyn's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I didn't remember," she said. "Not until I came back here." "What does it mean? Marked for what?" "They chose me," she said, her voice breaking. "When we were kids, they chose me and I never left. Not really." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "That's not true. We left together. We grew up. You've been living your life." "It wasn't my life," she said, her voice hollow. "It was borrowed time." Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind us. The air grew heavy and the whispers returned, louder than ever. The shadows seeped into the room, their shapes twisting and writhing like smoke. "They're coming," Evelyn said. The shadows circled us, their presence suffocating. I held on to Evelyn, refusing to let her go. "You can't have her," I shouted, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, rumbling voice. "She belongs to us," it said. "No, she doesn't," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Take me instead." Evelyn gasped. "Sophia, no!" The shadows hesitated, their movements slowing. "You would give yourself for her?" the voice asked. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Take me. Just let her go." The room fell silent. The shadows loomed closer, their dark tendrils reaching out to me. Evelyn screamed, trying to pull me back, but the shadows wrapped around me, their touch icy and suffocating. "Leave," the voice commanded her. "You are free." The last thing I saw was Evelyn's face, streaked with tears, as the shadows dragged me into the darkness. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't exist in this place. The whispers surround me, filling my mind with their endless chorus. But I don't regret my choice. Evelyn is free, and that's all that matters. Sometimes I hear her voice calling for me, faint and distant. I hope she's happy. I hope she's living the life she deserves. And I hope she never comes back to Blackthorn. I don't know how long I was trapped in the darkness. Time felt meaningless here, an endless void where the whispers never stopped. They told me things, terrible things about Evelyn, about Blackthorn, about myself. But somewhere, deep inside, I clung to the thought of her. Evelyn, my sister. She was free, and that meant I hadn't failed. Then one day, or night, or whatever passed for time here, I heard her voice. "Sophia." It came faintly at first, a distant echo barely cutting through the whispers. But it was unmistakable. Evelyn. The shadows shifted around me, restless, as if her voice disturbed them. "She shouldn't be here," the whispers hissed. "No!" I shouted into the void. "Leave her alone!" The shadows writhed, pulling tighter around me, but her voice grew louder, closer. And then I saw her, a faint, flickering light moving toward me through the darkness. "Sophia!" she called again, her voice trembling but determined. The light pushed back the shadows, driving them into retreat. She was holding something, a lantern, its glow warm and golden. "Evelyn," I gasped, tears streaming down my face. "You shouldn't have come." "I'm not leaving without you," she said, stepping closer. The light from the lantern was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It didn't just illuminate the darkness, it burned it away, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. "Where did you get that?" I asked, staring at it in awe. "It was in the attic," she said. At Blackthorn, I remembered the stories the other kids used to tell about a lantern that could find anyone, no matter where they were. I didn't think it was real, but her voice faltered, and she looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt. "I couldn't leave you here, Sophia. I just couldn't." The shadows roared, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, angry cacophony. "She must leave," the whispers demanded. "No!" Evelyn shouted, holding the lantern higher. Its light grew brighter, forcing the shadows back even further. "We're both leaving. You can't have her." The ground beneath us began to tremble, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. The shadows weren't retreating anymore. They were gathering, coalescing into a single, massive form. It towered over us, its shape shifting and writhing like a living storm. Two empty voids stared down at us, and its voice boomed, low and guttural. "You cannot leave. The deal was made. She is ours." "No!" Evelyn screamed. She doesn't belong to you. I grabbed her arm, my voice shaking. Evelyn, we have to go, now! But the shadows surged forward, their tendrils lashing out like whips. Evelyn held the lantern up, its light flaring brighter than ever, but the force of the shadows knocked her to the ground. I dove toward her, shielding her with my body. The lantern rolled away, its light flickering. You cannot take her, I shouted, my voice raw. The shadows hesitated for a moment, as if considering my words. Then they spoke again, their voices unified. Another deal must be made. Evelyn struggled to her feet, grabbing the lantern. What do you mean? She demanded, her voice trembling. The shadows shifted, forming a ring around us. One stays, the other is free. No, Evelyn said firmly. That's not an option, we're both leaving. The shadows loomed closer. One stays, they repeated. I grabbed Evelyn's arm, my heart breaking. You have to go, I said. Take the lantern and get out of here. No, she said, shaking her head violently. I'm not leaving you again. You have to, I said, tears streaming down my face. You've already given up so much for me. Please, just go. She stared at me, her face pale and stricken. Sophia, I can't. The shadows surged forward, their tendrils wrapping around me. Decide, they hissed, or both will stay. Before either of us could respond, the lantern flared to life on its own, its glow growing impossibly bright. The shadows recoiled, screaming as the light filled the void. And then the whispers changed. Stop her, they cried. She knows too much. I turned to Evelyn, confused. What are they talking about? Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. I remembered, she said softly. When I came back to Blackthorn, I remembered everything, the shadows, the deals, the children. What do you mean? I asked, my voice shaking. She looked away, her hands trembling. I made a deal when we were kids, she said. They were going to take you, Sophia. You were the one they wanted. But I offered myself instead. I stared at her, my mind racing. Evelyn, why didn't you tell me? Because it didn't matter, she said. You were free, and that was all that mattered. The shadows surged again, their rage palpable. She betrayed us, they roared. She must pay. Evelyn raised the lantern, its light burning brighter than ever. I won't let you take her, she shouted. The shadows recoiled, but they didn't retreat. I grabbed her hand, my voice steady despite the fear gripping me. We do this together, I said. She nodded, her grip tightening on the lantern. Together we stepped forward, the light pushing back the shadows. The whispers grew louder, angrier, but we didn't stop. The ground beneath us began to crumble, and the void seemed to collapse in on itself. The shadows screamed, their forms dissipating as the light consumed them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. We stumbled out of the basement, gasping for air. The lantern's light had faded, its glow now faint and flickering. Blackthorn was silent, the oppressive weight of the shadows gone. The orphanage felt empty, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. Evelyn leaned against the wall, her face pale and exhausted. It's over, she whispered. But I wasn't so sure. We left Blackthorn that night, driving away without looking back. Neither of us spoke during the ride, the silence heavy with unspoken questions. Evelyn fell asleep, her head resting against the window. I glanced at her, my heart aching. She'd sacrificed so much for me, her childhood, her freedom, and now I wondered what it had cost her to come back for me. When we reached home, Evelyn handed me the lantern. Keep it safe, she said, just in case. I nodded, placing it on the shelf in my living room. But even now, months later, I can still hear the whispers. They're faint, almost imperceptible, but they're there. And sometimes when I look at Evelyn, I see the shadows in her eyes. Blackthorn may be gone, but the shadows, they're always waiting. One night I woke to the sound of footsteps. I walked into the living room, my heart pounding. The lantern was glowing faintly, its light flickering like a heartbeat. And in the corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light, a shadow moved.
Have you ever lost someone? I mean really lost them, in a way that gnaws at your soul and keeps you awake at night? That's what happened to my nephew Danny. He disappeared in the woods one summer, and for 3 days we searched for him. When we found him, he wasn't the same. I wish I could say it ended there, but the truth is, I'm not sure we ever really brought him back. It happened last summer, during a family camping trip. My sister Lisa and her husband Dan had invited me to join them at Stone Hollow, a state park known for its endless hiking trails and dense woods. I brought my dog, Max, figuring it'd be a relaxing weekend outdoors. Danny, their 7-year-old son, was ecstatic. He loved the woods, climbing trees, chasing squirrels, pretending he was an explorer. I'd never seen a kid with so much energy. That first day was perfect. We set up camp, roasted hot dogs over the fire, and told ghost stories under the stars. Danny loved them, even though Lisa scolded me for scaring him before bed. The next morning, Danny begged us to take him on the longest trail in the park, one that led to a scenic overlook about 3 miles from the campsite. It was an easy hike, well marked, and we figured we'd be back by lunchtime. But things didn't go as planned. Danny ran ahead, as usual, darting between the trees, with Max close behind. I shouted for him to stay where we could see him, and for a while he listened, circling back to show us a cool rock or a stick he'd found. About halfway to the overlook, we reached a fork in the trail. One path was wide and well-worn, the other was narrower, overgrown, and marked with an old wooden sign that had long since faded. "Danny, stay on the main path," Lisa said, her voice firm, but Danny was already heading down the narrower trail. "It's a shortcut," he called out, grinning over his shoulder. "Come back," Lisa shouted, but he didn't stop. Max barked and took off after him, disappearing into the trees. I ran after them, calling Danny's name. The trail was steeper than it looked, winding downhill through dense underbrush. I could hear Max barking somewhere ahead, but couldn't see him or Danny. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. No barking, no footsteps. Just the sound of my own breathing and the rustle of leaves in the wind. "Danny?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. There was no answer. We spent hours searching for him. Lisa was frantic, calling his name over and over until her voice was hoarse. Dan and I fanned out, combing the area, but the trail seemed to twist and double back on itself, leading nowhere. When the sun began to set, we called the park rangers. They brought in a search team, volunteers, dogs, even a helicopter, but no one could find him. Max came back that night, whimpering and shaking, but there was no sign of Danny. We stayed up all night at the campsite, huddled around the fire. Lisa cried into her hands while Dan stared into the flames, his face blank. I tried to reassure them, but deep down I felt it too, that sinking dread that we'd never see Danny again. The next morning, the search resumed. The rangers found footprints leading off the trail, but they ended abruptly in a patch of soft dirt. "It's like he just disappeared," one of them said, shaking his head. Lisa refused to leave the area, insisting that Danny was still out there. "He's smart," she said, over and over, as if trying to convince herself. "He'll find his way back." But as the hours passed, her hope began to waver. That afternoon, one of the volunteers, a local man in his 60s, pulled me aside. "You need to be careful out here," he said, his voice low. "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "Stone Hollow's got stories," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "People disappearing. Kids, mostly. They say there's something in the woods that takes them." I laughed nervously. "You don't actually believe that, do you?" The man didn't smile. "All I'm saying is, if you find him, he might not be the same." It wasn't until the third day that we found him. Lisa was the one who spotted him, sitting at the base of a large oak tree about a mile from the campsite. His clothes were torn, his face smudged with dirt, but he didn't look scared or upset. He was just sitting there, staring at nothing. "Danny!" Lisa cried, running to him. He looked up at her, his expression blank. "I'm tired," he said softly. We took him back to the campsite, wrapping him in a blanket and giving him water. He didn't say much, just kept repeating, "I'm tired. I want to go home." But something about him felt off.
That night, while everyone else slept, I stayed up watching Danny. He was lying in the tent, his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. "Danny," I whispered. "What happened out there?" He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting mine. "They showed me the way," he said. "The way to what?" I asked, my stomach twisting. He didn't answer. Instead, he sat up and pointed toward the woods. "They're waiting," he said. I froze. "Who's waiting?" But Danny just lay back down, closing his eyes as if nothing had happened. The next morning, Danny seemed fine, almost too fine. He was cheerful, eating breakfast like nothing had happened. Lisa and Dan were relieved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. I unzipped the flap and saw Danny standing at the edge of the woods, his back to me. "Danny!" I hissed, climbing out of the tent. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. He just stepped into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I ran after him, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The trail twisted and turned, and I felt like I was running in circles. And then I saw them. Figures, pale and silent, standing between the trees. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel them watching me. "Danny!" I shouted, my voice shaking. He was standing in the middle of the trail, surrounded by the figures. They didn't touch him, but their presence was suffocating. "Go back," he said, his voice calm. "What are you talking about?" I said, stepping closer. "You don't belong here," he said. And then the figures stepped forward, blocking my view. I woke up at the campsite, lying next to the fire pit. Danny was sitting beside Lisa, eating breakfast like nothing had happened. I asked him about the night before, but he just smiled and said, "You must have had a bad dream." We left Stone Hollow that afternoon. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see those figures. I feel their eyes on me. And Danny? He's not the same. He still laughs, still plays, but there's something missing. Or maybe something extra. I don't know what happened to him in those woods, but one thing's for sure. Whatever came back wasn't entirely my nephew.